Okay, we're still in 8c. I want to focus on the voting window significance. Here we are, the voting window, and that's in row 27. There are two voting windows. This is really important to understand where the 120 years in Genesis 6 comes from. When God announces that He's going to give 120 years, this is an example of something He does a lot, which I call mirroring. It's a kind of synonym for restitution. If something gets completed, then it's mirrored back. That's really important to understand, because Daniel 9 is all about restitution and mirroring, and that's one reason why we get confused in Daniel 9. We don't know about this rule. And again, like everything else, precedence is in, pre-Israel. That's where Israel gets its Mosaic laws, from precedented stuff. Okay, you have a voting window here in row 27 for the world. That includes all the unbelievers. How many? It's kind of a mass criterion. How many of them want to know, and want to believe in God? You see that later version of that when Abraham is trying to talk God out of going to Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, what if there are only 10? And God's saying, well, if there are only 10, I'm going to save the whole city. It's the same concept. All right? And because nobody but, Lot and his daughters and wife wanted to believe in God, then the whole city was destroyed. It's the same. That concept is rooted back here. This is the first voting window in history, row 27, between 1,000 and 1,050. That's 50 years. Now look at the second one in row 37. That's the second, that's the second voting window in the new 1,000. The new 1,000 begins right here in row 28. We had a voting window here, didn't go well. And we have the new 1,000 beginning because Enoch had met the criteria for a 1,000-year grant. Probably, Enoch did. And then we have Noah here in the second voting window. It's the first voting window of the new millennium. But it is the second voting window in question when God's going to come up with His 120 years. In other words, when He pronounces this 120 years in Genesis 6, it's 1536 from Adam. All right? When He's doing that, which means it's 2570 BC. When He announces that to Noah, and then Noah's job, of course, was to tell everybody else while he's building the boat, when God announces that, the issue is determined, or the count of the years is determined, first of all, because it's 4 generations. The 4-generation curse doctrine has its precedence here too. But secondly, notice, because the next voting window hasn't completed. We had a bad voting window in row 27 between 1,000 and 1,050 from Adam. But we don't have a believer voting window. So the believer's voting window has to also occur before the flood can occur. All right, so that's why he's talking about the 120 years. All right, and he's dating it from 1536 because he had to wait for the outcome of this. I mean, because it's all about, who's voting and all that. And, Lamech was positive. It doesn't look like he got a 490, however. But Noah was very positive, and of course Noah is born in 1056, right after the new period starts. So Noah has to get enough time to decide whether he's going to super mature. So this is basically because of Noah from the get-go. All right? 1056 is when Noah is born. 1056 is when is just 6 years after the new period. So 1556, when Noah matures, is during the second voting period. So you add that plus this first voting period, and that's where you're getting the 120 from. It's announced in advance, all right, because you'll notice that the end of the third historical 490 is 1540. So this having been so negative, God is giving you advance warning. Hey, you're coming, believers, you're coming into a voting period after 1540, which is right during this time here between 1540 and 1610. So you better vote positive, or the world's going to end. That's why he announces it in 1536. See the timing? You wouldn't know that if you didn't plot the dates. In other words, this was information everybody knew and took for granted. That's why they all remembered the dates. All right? And so this is recorded for us to know how come. It's not like we can't find out. All you got to do is plot it. That's all I did here. Okay, so here you got your 70-year voting period between 1540 and 1610. All right? And Noah votes, and he gets his covenant. So that's why the flood can happen, but the human race is not destroyed. That's where I ended it at the last video. Now we're going to get into Abraham, because things kind of change at this point. All right, again, we saw that Noah's covenant for the 490 would end in 2046, so somebody else has to super mature by that point, or all time ends. Okay, we also are coming up on the deadline of a qualifying period for a 1000. And so Noah must have gotten that 1000. Okay, so Noah's 1000 would have run from 1556 to just 50 years later. Look at that. 1556 plus 1000 is 2056. 2046, okay, is when his 490 runs out. I'm sorry, wait a minute. 2500. Okay, so the 1000 is no problem. The 490 is a problem. The 1000 can't happen if the 490 doesn't happen. All right, so 2046 is the year his 490 runs out. He's got 1000 covering it, but again, there has to be a 490 underpinning, or the 1000 doesn't occur. What I'm trying to say here, that the Bible reveals, and you're going to see this very dramatically in the case of David, the 490 is required for the 1000 to play. If the 490 is met, the 1000 can be met. But if the 1000 intervenes sooner, if there's a cutoff due to somebody's 1000-year grant expiring, and Daniel 9 is based on this rule. If the 1000-year deadline precedes the 490-year deadline, then the 1000-year deadline is the one you got to beat to meet time, to renew time. And in Daniel 9, that's exactly what God uses, is that rule. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just notice here, 490 and 1000, both rules come into play. Look at how both you've got the contiguity of the 490-year deadline, historically from Adam. Noah met this, 400 years prior. The 1000-year deadline historically, comes up, and just 46 years later, Noah's own personal 490, which extended. Notice how it extended beyond the deadline here. So it extended time just long enough. This is so dramatic. All history hinged on this year, which was 2060 BC. Abraham matured in that year, super matured. Now Abraham also gets a 1000-year covenant. Well, he gets a covenant, so he got the 1000 years, and he got the 490. And again, it's commemorated by the birth of a son, in this case Isaac. All right? So now everything hangs on Abraham. Now Abraham, like Noah, got a covenant. Abraham's covenant is different from Noah's in that Abraham is the progenitor of the Jews. That's the promise. Okay? Isaac is the son of that promise. It wasn't to be any other son, because Isaac was the son of Sarah, and Sarah also matured. I don't know how much. Okay. Isaac definitely is a sign of this being met, the 1000-year and the 490, because of the covenant that goes along with it. All right, now the story gets really complicated. It looks like, but I can't say for sure, it looks like Isaac also super matured and got a 490. So I've got him colored in blue, but I'm not 100% sure of that. The reason I think it's true is because the covenant was renewed severally with Isaac separately. In order for that if that occurred, then that means he's super matured. Now, the next person, though, who gets it is Jacob, because again, God severally gives him the covenant, and renames him. Renaming is a sign of adoption, covenantal action. So that happened, though, not with the birth of a son. That happened in 1940 BC. Now, the weird part is that it shifts. The 490 tracking that the Bible follows shifts to Joseph, and it shifts to Joseph in this year, 1930 BC. This is the year that Joseph, age 17, is enslaved in Egypt. Now, I'm not 100% sure why. It's hard for me to believe that Joseph super matured by age 17. But since the promise is going to the family, and it transfers to Joseph, because he's enslaved and because Jacob got, or at least even Isaac got, because we've got 490-year protection going on here. The shift to Joseph is partly due to his maturity, but it's at least due to Jacob. Okay, Jacob and or Isaac getting a covenant. One of them, or both of them probably, because they got the covenant severally renewed. Okay, so with Joseph, for sure we know that when he was enslaved in 1930 BC, which was year 2176, that's another 490, because it ends with Moses and the Exodus. And you're going to see that in a minute. Just focus on this right now. The year is 1930 when he goes into slavery. It's the 2176th year from Adam. We're still pretty new into the millennial period. All right? And the actual dating of this, 1930, could be due to something. I mean, Jacob got his covenant in 1940. It could be that Isaac super matured in 1930 BC. I mean, I'm really not sure. But 1930 BC is when the benchmark is. All right? And it shifts. Now, Joseph was definitely extremely mature spiritually, because God uses him to deliver Egypt, and he's only 30 years old at the time he becomes vizier in 1916 BC. Now, Encyclopedia Britannica and some other sources talk about a vizier under Amenhotep who redid the Fayum Depression and basically redid the administration of Egypt. Obviously, they don't mention Joseph by name. But that's the vizier of that time period, is Joseph. In other words, I'm doing just the Bible dates. Independently, I went and looked in Encyclopedia Britannica, my 1985 hardback edition. I'm not so sure that the current edition online is going to have the same information in it. But in my hardback, it talks about this vizier who basically redid Egypt under Amenhotep the first and second, and you're going to see this. Not Amenhotep. I'm sorry. Amenemhet. Amenemhet begins to rule. Amenemhet is the second. Begins to rule in 1929 BC. That's a year after Joseph was enslaved. So he's the pharaoh of the dream. All right, again, this is per Encyclopedia Britannica. They don't show the same dates. Egyptology is kind of screwed up since 1985. I don't know what went wrong with it, but it was more accurate back in the 1980s and prior than it is now. It's really goofball now. But at any rate, this is the guy, and in his administration, in Amenemhet's II's administration, that's when you see this vizier doing things with the Fayum Depression and redoing the entire administration of Egypt. And of course, that's the Bible story about what Joseph did. So you got two, you ought to be able to confirm this extra biblically. You just won't know that it's Joseph. All right. So whoever they say was the Pharaoh, they're going to maybe give him a different name. At that point in 1929 BC, that's the guy. All right. Now, Joseph becomes vizier in 1916. He's 30 years old at that point. All right. He will rule as vizier for 80 years and therefore dies at 110 per the Bible. In the Bible, when you have the 7 fat years of the dream, this is when it begins. This is when it ends, 1876. And a 7 is always inside a 40-year judgment, testing, wilderness period. In other words, everything that you see in the timing for the Jews is precedented on something prior. This is what it's precedented on. Okay? So there are 2 back-to-back 40 years with the 7s at the beginning and the end. So this one runs from 1916 to 1876, and then this one runs from 1875 to 1868. The 7-year period that does. All right? You can do the math and see it here. This is the it tells you who ruled and all that good stuff. Okay, so it's a pivotal period, and it's of course a setup for Israel to go into the land. They have to go into Egypt and be enslaved for 430 years. All right, that's in row 69. In order for them to enter the land, 400 of those years they are enslaved as slaves. The first 30 years are nice because Joseph's still alive and is vizier. All right? It's sort of the changeover takes place in the last 4 years of his life. So he must have retired 4 years before he died. Something like that. I can't refine it much further than that. Okay, so here we are looking at the switchover from 1930, 400 years later, is Moses. Take a look at this. 2176? Let's see. 2666 is when it ends. Let's just do it based on that. 2666, 2176. I think it's right, but let me see. 2176, 2666. Yeah. So 2176 is when the 490 measurement period that the Bible follows switches to Joseph's year being enslaved in Egypt. And then 490 years after that is the Exodus. And that's when Moses gets his 490 and his 1,000. Because the covenant, and this is something that's usually not known, the covenant that God makes with Moses. He doesn't make it with Israel. He makes it with Moses. And you see that in the discussion about the burning bush. Moses doesn't want to be God's mouthpiece. He gets nervous about it. So Aaron is the mouthpiece. Israel is delivered through Moses. You see Paul talk about that when he talks about the baptism of Moses. Search on baptism of Moses in your English Bible. You should find it. I think it's in Corinthians somewhere. So 490 years after Joseph's enslavement in Egypt, which is right here, that's when the Exodus goes, and that's when a new 490 begins. Okay. Before we go on with what happened with Moses in Israel again, I want to do a little recapping to show you more about how God tracks us and the importance of these dates. Remember when we said, I remember when we went over how Noah's covenant ran out in 2046 from Adam's fall. It started in 5056 from Adam's fall, ran out in 2046, which was the same year that Abram got his 490, his covenant, which we know because of the covenant that God made with Abraham. Everybody knows that. Notice that is 4 years before the second 1000 ends. Notice also that it is at the beginning, just before the civilization voting period. The voting period, it's intercalated when it's on real history, just like God would intercalate to solar from a lunar year. It's kind of analogous to a lunar year in the sense of the qualification is contiguous. It's 490, 490, 490. So it's 490 from Adam, 980 from Adam, another 490 after that. Those are how the qualifying periods. Somebody in each qualifying period must meet the deadline. Okay? See, like here's the third in row 31, here's the third contiguous qualifying from Adam, all right? And the person, of course, who met that had already been Enoch and Methuselah, all right? I'm sorry, Noah. No, Enoch and Methuselah. Methuselah dies in 1656, so he's the guy who met it by 1470 when the third qualifying period ended. The historical periods, however, are intercalated with the voting periods. So you got a voting window that's 50 years here. We saw the first voting window between 490 and 560 here in row 20. Okay, row 27, that's the first voting window for civilization. It did not go well. Then we have God announcing the bad results, but he's announcing it before the second voting window in row 34. That's why it's 120 years that he's announcing. And therefore you have two timings that are being tracked analogous to a calendar. Analogous to really the Jewish calendar, but I mean any calendar. I mean the world operated on a lunar calendar and a solar calendar since Adam. Okay, so it's like analogous to a solar calendar every 490 years. I mean a lunar calendar every 490 years. It's analogous to a solar calendar when you intercalate, so to speak, with the voting period of the 50 years and the voting period of the 70 years. So that in 1050 you have the end of a civilization you have the end of a civilization 1000, including the voting period. All right, but the qualification for the 1000 is not intercalated. So it's 1000, 2000 was the end. All right? Well, Noah had met the second 1000. Okay, but who's going to meet the third 1000? That turns out to be Abraham, and he's doing it during the last 50 years of the second 1000, because the second 1000 intercalated begins in 1050, therefore 1,000 years after that is 2050. And intercalating just a regular single year calendar is hard enough on people, but God's intercalating whole centuries and millennia. And you got to know that, because it's going to be really important when you see David's time grants, because this intercalation has an awful lot to do with how history plays. All right, so Noah, his 490 ends there. Abraham gets it. Abraham gets the 490 just in time. He also gets it just at the end of the civilization 2000. So that justifies another 1,000 years going on if there are going to be other people who get 490-year grants, because obviously Abraham isn't going to live that long. All right? So now you have the next guy is probably Isaac, maybe not Isaac, definitely, well, no, probably Isaac and Jacob. That's why time was so good during that time. Then you have it switched to Joseph. Now it switches to Joseph because at least by 30 he had super matured enough. All right? But maybe he did super mature by 17, I don't know. But it's dated from 1930 BC when he went into slavery. Okay, that ends with Moses and the Exodus. Now look at this. All right? That's well before the ending of the qualifying period. So we got this covered. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Probably all four of them got it. Now you know why the promise is based on them. All right, Abraham's personal 490 ends here in 2536 from Adam, which should be 1570, and that's going to be important, 1570 BC. Now, Noah's personal 1000 is going to end in 2556, so we got an expiry of two benefit periods. All right, occurring right there. So life gets worse for the world as a result. Remember, when there's more than one 490, more than one 1000 period overlapping, the world gets better benefit, but it does not extend the time, because the time is like a relay race. The time extension has to be at least one in each time period. Okay. So this is when Egypt has its prosperity. Egypt was really prosperous during this time. Amenhotep I comes to power. All right, and you'll notice that he comes to power, just before Moses is born. Moses is born in 1520 BC. All right, according to the Bible. And Amenhotep I begins rule. He can't have kids. That brings out Thutmose I, one of his generals, and therefore Thutmose II, who is a natural son of Thutmose I, begins to rule. He marries Hatshepsut, who's his half-sister. Hatshepsut is going to be the one to find Moses in the water. Moses means drawn from the water. It's a moniker only of. See, there's no confusion about when Moses was born. The Mose moniker, and see, it says Thutmose, M-O-S-E ending. That's only used of this dynasty. All right? Only, period. Never anywhere else. So, to name him Moses, it has to do with Isis and being drawn from the water, and Isis being a god of water and their patron god. He's named Moses to signify that it's from Hatshepsut and Thutmose II. It was done to cement her rule because Thutmose II died early. And if she remarried, she would have caused a diplomatic problem, and would have had, as a woman, she would have had a problem of somebody ruling over her, and therefore Egypt would have been dominated. So she comes up with this very brilliant idea that the god Isis gave her Moses, who's a guy, all right, and so now she's the regent for Moses, so now she doesn't have to marry. The very strong political thing. It's very easy to figure out. I don't know why everybody has so much trouble figuring out when Moses was born. They assign him to Ramses III, which is totally ridiculous. Or Ramses II. It's dumb. There's no reason to do that. The Moses moniker is only used by this dynasty here, the Thutmose dynasty. Period. Okay. So now you got Moses born in 1520. He super matures, get this, look at this real closely. He super matures during, remember, he leaves Egypt. Notice how this is during a voting period from 2590 from Adam to 2660 from Adam. Moses, it was Noah before. This time it's Moses doing the super voting. Moses super matures during the voting period, which happens just in time because, look, Jacob's personal 490 ends in 2656 from Adam. All right, that would be 1450 BC. That's when it ends. 10 years before the Exodus. So that's how you know that Joseph got a grant. Because Joseph's grant would end in 1440. We saw that up here. This is when Joseph's grant begins, 2176 from Adam. This is when it ends in 2666, which is 10 years after Jacob's personal 490 ends. So there you have a dramatic example of how these 490s work. And you can't know them if you don't plot the dates. We know that 490 means something in Daniel 9, but that's not the only instance, obviously. God is using a well-known accounting system to explain to Daniel why he can justify granting Israel another 400, well, it turns out to be 600 and some years. But I'll get to that when I get there. All right, right now, just notice, Moses, Egypt, 1440 BC, that's when the Bible says the Exodus happened. No doubt about it, at all. All right? Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, or whoever the current archaeology says was the pharaoh in 1450 BC. My Encyclopedia Britannica says it was Amenhotep II. And it's real interesting because Amenhotep II only has 9 campaigns. He supposedly ruled for 25 years, but he only has 9 campaigns. It was your job as a ruler to have a campaign once a year. That means you only ruled for 9 years. Guess what? 1050 minus 1040 is 10 years. And Bible says that Pharaoh drowned in the sea, and they called it the Reed Sea in Moses' day, but the Greeks renamed it the Red Sea because of what happened. Because of Pharaoh's drowning with the troops. It was the Greeks who renamed it. And it was really famous in Greek drama. And that's where the name Red Sea came from the Greeks, not from the Hebrews. So 2660 BC, Moses leads the Exodus. Now we have a huge change in the way time is accounted. It's still 490-year increments, but it's now 490-year increments based on the nation. Now you have to think about that for a minute. Just sit down and relax a little bit, because I'm not going to move the cursor for a few minutes. All this time, one person was the criterion for granting time. We're in a trial. The pressure on that one person would have been absolutely enormous. You're not looking at works here. You're looking at how much that person wanted God and what God did to that person to mature him in God's thinking as then revealed. It has nothing to do with works. Because we know from history that lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of good deeds were done. They built buildings, they built civilizations, they conquered the world, and none of that counts with God. So any Christian who's talking about works doesn't even know the Bible. Just you might as well, he doesn't even know his spiritual ABCs. Because there's nothing that these people did. Noah built a boat so he could get out of there. You can't call that a work. Enoch evangelized the world. Probably. I mean, we don't have actual proof of that, but what work does it record even of Enoch? Enoch was the best person in the Old Testament. Just says that he walked with God and God took him. Doesn't say anything about any good deeds he did. Doesn't say about any buildings he built. Doesn't say how many poor he fed. He walked with God. That's in his head. All right? There are no deeds here that are mentioned. They're heroes, but it doesn't record them as heroes because of what they did. Same thing here with Moses. I mean, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, yeah. Okay, but what did Moses actually do? He talked to Pharaoh over and over and over again. And he had to appoint 70 people to help him as far as ruling the people goes. But yet God says that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. It's talking about Moses being objective and thinking toward God. There is no works there. It's Moses' attitude. Now obviously if you have an attitude toward God, you're not going to be immoral. But works don't count. The Pharisees' works didn't count. Alright? Moses, on behalf of Israel, Israel on behalf of Moses, because Moses is the one granted the covenant here, leads Egypt. That's why Israel got to get out. Now, because Moses didn't want to be God's mouthpiece, Israel gets the time grant from this point forward. In 1440 BC, and it's supposed to go all the way to the end of time, and you'll see that in a few minutes, Israel gets the covenant corporately. Now, it was hard on one person to do this, but you could argue, well, yeah, but it's only one person. How much pressure can you bring to bear? La, 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 la. Okay, but now a whole nation has to vote for God. That's why you have the 70 sabbatical years. That's why you have Jubilee, because the nation is now going to be the priest nation for the world. And if the nation votes negatively, then the world dies.